Gate agent shouts at black teen, then she calls her airline CEO dad to shut the flight down. I've told you 3 times already, miss. Your ID doesn't match your boarding pass, and I don't care who you think you are. This flight is fully booked, and you're not getting on it today or any other day. That's perfectly fine, ma'am. I understand you're just doing your job. Would you mind if I make a quick phone call before I step aside? The gate agent's face twisted into a smug smile as she gestured dramatically toward the waiting area, clearly enjoying the power she held over the situation. The bustling Terminal C of Atlanta International Airport continued its normal chaos around them, but for 16-year-old Zora Johnson, everything had narrowed to this confrontation. Travelers streamed past, some slowing to watch the scene unfold. A middle-aged white gate agent with perfectly coiffed blonde hair and a pristine blue uniform standing over a young black girl in jeans and a Howard University sweatshirt. Zora's hands trembled slightly as she reached for her phone, but her expression remained composed, almost eerily calm. "You can make all the calls you want, honey, but you're still not boarding this plane," the gate agent, whose name tag read Patricia, said loudly enough for nearby passengers to hear. "Next in line, please." But Zora didn't move from her spot at the counter. Instead, she pressed a single button on her phone and waited, her eyes never leaving Patricia's face. The phone rang only once before being answered. "Dad, it's me. I'm having a problem at gate C42 with one of your employees." Her voice was steady, clear. "Yes, I showed her both IDs. Yes, I explained about the name change after the adoption. She says I'm lying." Patricia's smirk began to fade as Zora continued the conversation, her confident tone never wavering. "Patricia Dawson, yes, I understand. I'll wait right here. Thank you, Dad. But let's go back to how this all started." It was just 3 hours earlier when Zora woke in her dorm room at Spelman College, excited for her first Thanksgiving break since starting college. Zora had been counting down the days until she could return home to Chicago. As a first-year student at Spelman College in Atlanta, the adjustment had been challenging even for someone as adaptable as she was. The early November morning was unusually warm as she finished packing her carry-on suitcase, double-checking that she had everything she needed. "Don't forget your charger again," her roommate Tanya said, still buried under her comforter. "Your dad will have to send another one." "Got it right here," Zora replied, patting her backpack. "And I remembered my ID this time, too." This wasn't just any Thanksgiving for the Johnson family. It was the first holiday since Zora's formal adoption had been finalized in August, though she had lived with Robert Johnson and his wife Carol since she was 13. The legal process had been lengthy, complicated by the fact that Robert was the recently appointed CEO of Meridian Airlines, one of the country's largest carriers. The adoption had come with a name change, from Zora Williams to Zora Johnson, but her school ID still carried her former name while her new driver's license showed her current legal name. It was a discrepancy that had caused minor confusion before, but nothing that a simple explanation couldn't resolve. "You sure you don't want me to drive you to the airport?" Tanya asked, finally emerging from her cocoon of blankets. "No need. Dad sent a car," Zora said, zipping her suitcase closed. "One of the few perks of having an airline CEO as a father," Tanya laughed. "Girl, you never use those perks. Most people would be flying private and bragging about their famous dad all over campus, but half our friends don't even know who your father is." Zora shrugged. "You know how I feel about that. I'm here on a scholarship I earned before the adoption. I want to make it on my own merits." She glanced at her watch. "Car should be here in 15 minutes. "Thank you," Zora replied with a smile, relieved that the explanation had been accepted so easily. She made her way to security, where the TSA agent also noted the discrepancy but was satisfied with her explanation. With 2 hours until her flight, Zora found a quiet corner in a coffee shop near her gate and pulled out her laptop to finish a paper due after the break. She was deep in concentration when her phone rang. The screen displayed Dad, and she answered immediately. "Hey, Dad. Zora, are you at the airport already?" Robert Johnson's warm voice came through the speaker. "Yep, got here with plenty of time. Flight's at 1:30. I was thinking about the name issue. Did you have any problems with your ID?" Zora smiled at her father's concern. "Nothing major. The check-in agent made a note in the system." Good, good. Listen, I called because there's been a gate change. You're now departing from C42 instead of B18. They're making an announcement, but I wanted to make sure you knew." "Thanks, Dad. I appreciate it, but you don't need to monitor my flight, you know. I'm a big girl." Robert chuckled. I know, old habits. Your mom's already got your room ready, and she's planning a feast. I think she's invited half the neighborhood to welcome you home. Tell her not to go overboard. Zora said, though she knew it was futile. Carol Johnson's enthusiasm for holidays was legendary. Too late for that. Oh, and Marcus is flying in from Stanford tomorrow. He's eager to see his little sister. Zora felt a surge of excitement at the mention of her adoptive brother. Marcus, the Johnsons' biological son, was a senior at Stanford and her biggest supporter when Robert and Carol had first taken her in. Can't wait to see him too. I should go, Dad. Need to finish this paper before my flight. All right, sweetheart. Text me when you board. Love you. Love you too, Dad. Zora ended the call and returned to her paper, but her concentration was broken. She found herself thinking about the journey that had brought her to this point in her life. 3 years ago, she had been Zora Williams, a troubled 13-year-old in Chicago's foster care system. Her mother had died when she was 11, and there was no father in the picture. She had bounced between 3 foster homes in 2 years, acting out and getting into trouble at school. The turning point came when she was selected for a mentorship program sponsored by Meridian Airlines for at-risk youth. The program paired teens with company executives, and by some stroke of luck, Zora was matched with Robert Johnson, then the COO of the company. From their first meeting, there had been an unexpected connection. Robert, who had grown up in similar circumstances in South Chicago in the 1970s, saw himself in Zora's intelligence and determination. What was meant to be a 6-month mentorship extended to a year, with Zora spending weekends at the Johnson home, becoming close with Carol and Marcus. When Zora's third foster placement fell through, the Johnsons stepped in, initially as emergency foster parents, then with the intention to adopt. The process had been complicated, delayed by background checks, home studies, and the scrutiny that came with Robert's high-profile position when he was promoted to CEO last year. The final adoption had been approved just 3 months ago, in time for Zora to start college with her new legal name, though the paperwork for updating all her identification was still in process. Zora was pulled from her reminiscence by an announcement over the airport's PA system. Attention passengers! Meridian Airlines Flight 1372 to Chicago is now boarding at Gate C42. All passengers please proceed to Gate C42. She checked her watch. It was still an hour before the scheduled departure. Confused, she packed up her laptop and made her way to the new gate, navigating through the crowded terminal. Gate C42 was a scene of confusion when she arrived. A line had formed, and the gate agent, a different woman from the one at check-in, was dealing with agitated passengers. Zora joined the line, checking her boarding pass to confirm the flight number. "What's happening?" she asked the elderly man in front of her. "They're saying there's a mechanical issue with the plane, so they've moved us to a smaller aircraft," he explained. "Now some folks are being told they won't have seats. It's the holiday rush all over again. Back in '85, I was stranded in Denver for 3 days because of an airline mix-up. Missed my daughter's graduation." Zora nodded sympathetically, listening to the man's story as the line inched forward. When she finally reached the counter, she handed her boarding pass and ID to the gate agent, a woman with a pinched expression and perfectly styled blonde hair. The gate agent, Patricia, according to her name tag, looked between Zora's driver's license and her boarding pass, her eyes narrowing. "These don't match." "Yes, I know," Zora explained calmly. "I was recently adopted and my name changed from Williams to Johnson. I have my school ID as well, which shows my former name." She handed over her Spelman College ID card. Patricia barely glanced at the school ID before pushing it back across the counter. "Anyone could make up a story like that. I need matching identification or I can't let you board." "The check-in agent made a note in the system," Zora said, still keeping her voice level. "It shouldn't be a problem." Patricia's fingers clacked on the keyboard, her eyes scanning the screen. "I don't see any note, and now we have an oversold situation. Without proper identification, I'm afraid you'll have to be rebooked." "Could you please check again?" Zora asked. "My legal name is Zora Johnson. The ticket was purchased under Williams before my adoption was finalized." "Look, miss," Patricia said, her voice rising slightly. "We have paying customers with proper identification waiting. I've checked the system, and there's no note about any name change. You'll need to step aside and go to customer service." Zora felt a flicker of frustration but kept her expression neutral. "I understand there's an issue with the smaller aircraft, but I have a confirmed seat. Could you please call your supervisor to resolve this?" Patricia's face hardened. "I am the supervisor on duty, and I've made my decision. Your identification doesn't match your boarding pass, which means you could be anyone. In today's world, we take security seriously." By now, several nearby passengers were watching the exchange. Zora felt a familiar knot in her stomach. the sensation she'd experienced many times before when facing prejudice that wasn't explicitly stated but was unmistakably present. "I've explained the situation," she said evenly. "I've shown you both IDs. This is a legitimate ticket that I purchased. There must be a way to verify my identity." "I've told you 3 times already, miss. Your ID doesn't match your boarding pass, and I don't care who you think you are. This flight is fully booked, and you're not getting on it today or any other day." "That's perfectly fine, ma'am. I understand you're just doing your job. Would you mind if I make a quick phone call before I step aside?" The gate agent's face twisted into a smug smile as she gestured dramatically toward the waiting area, clearly enjoying the power she held over the situation. The bustling Terminal C of Atlanta International Airport continued its normal chaos around them. But for 16-year-old Zora Johnson, everything had narrowed to this confrontation. Travelers streamed past, some slowing to watch the scene unfold. A middle-aged white gate agent with perfectly coiffed blonde hair and a pristine blue uniform standing over a young black girl in jeans and a Howard University sweatshirt. Zora's hands trembled slightly as she reached for her phone, but her expression remained composed, almost eerily calm. "You can make all the calls you want, honey, but you're still not boarding this plane," the gate agent, whose name tag read Patricia, said loudly enough for nearby passengers to hear. "Next in line, please." But Zora didn't move from her spot at the counter. Instead, she pressed a single button on her phone and waited, her eyes never leaving Patricia's face. The phone rang only once before being answered. "Dad, it's me. I'm having a problem at gate C42 with one of your employees." Her voice was steady, clear. "Yes, I showed her both IDs. Yes, I explained about the name change after the adoption. She says I'm lying." Patricia's smirk began to fade as Zora continued the conversation, her confident tone never wavering. "Patricia Dawson, yes, I understand. I'll wait right here. Thank you, Dad." Zora ended the call and slipped the phone back into her pocket. "My father suggests that you check your employee messages immediately. He's also on his way down from the executive offices." Patricia's face had lost all color. "Your father?" "Robert Johnson, CEO of Meridian Airlines," Zora replied quietly. "But honestly, it shouldn't matter who my father is. I'm a confirmed passenger with valid identification and an explanation for the name discrepancy." Patricia quickly turned to her computer terminal, her fingers now shaking as she typed. Within seconds, her expression changed from disbelief to alarm as she read something on her screen. There appears to have been a misunderstanding," she stammered, her earlier confidence evaporated. "Let me see those IDs again." Zora handed them over silently, aware of the whispers from passengers in line who had witnessed the exchange. Patricia scrutinized the IDs with newfound attention, nodding vigorously. "Yes, I see the issue now. I apologize for the confusion, Ms. Johnson. The note about your name change is indeed in the system." Her voice had transformed into a honeyed sweetness that was almost comical in its insincerity. "Let me get you your boarding pass right away." "Thank you," Zora said simply, accepting the boarding pass that Patricia hastily printed and thrust toward her. "You're in seat 12A, will be boarding in just a few minutes. Again, my sincere apologies for the misunderstanding." Zora nodded but didn't move away from the counter. The man who had been behind her in line, a gray-haired gentleman in a business suit, stepped up. "Excuse me," he said to Patricia. "I couldn't help overhearing. This young lady explained her situation very clearly, and you dismissed her without proper consideration until you learned who her father was. I find that troubling." Patricia's face flushed. "Sir, there was a miscommunication, and I've apologized. I'd like to speak to the actual supervisor," the man interrupted. "My name is Thomas Wilkins, and I'm a Platinum Executive member with over 2 million miles on Meridian. I'd like to register a complaint." As if on cue, a commotion at the entrance to the gate area drew everyone's attention. Robert Johnson, a tall, distinguished black man in his 50s, strode purposefully toward the counter, accompanied by 2 other executives in suits. Despite the casual Friday attire of khakis and a navy blazer, his commanding presence was unmistakable. "Zora," he said, embracing his daughter briefly before turning to Patricia, whose complexion had gone from red to ashen. "Ms. Dawson, I presume?" "Yes, sir," Patricia managed, her voice barely audible. "I understand there was a problem with my daughter's boarding pass." "It's been resolved, sir. A miscommunication." Robert nodded slowly, his expression neutral but his eyes sharp. "I see. James," he said, turning to one of the executives beside him, "please take Ms. Dawson to the office. We need to understand exactly what happened here." "Mr. Johnson," the man who had spoken up earlier interjected, "I witnessed the entire exchange. I'd be happy to provide a statement." "Thank you, sir." That would be helpful. Robert handed the man a business card. Please email me directly with your observations. Now, if you'll excuse us, I need a moment with my daughter. Robert guided Zora a few steps away from the counter, his hand gentle on her shoulder. Are you okay? Zora nodded. I'm fine, Dad, really. You shouldn't have had to deal with that. His voice was tight with controlled anger. It's not the first time and it won't be the last, Zora replied pragmatically. But I handled it. Yes, you did. His expression softened with pride. Very professionally from what I could hear. The remaining executive, a woman in her 40s with natural hair and a sharp pantsuit, approached them. Robert, the station manager, is here. Also, operations says the original aircraft is actually fine. There was a miscommunication about the equipment change. All passengers will be accommodated on the original plane. Thank you, Diana, Robert replied. Please make an announcement. As Diana moved toward the counter, Robert turned back to Zora. I need to handle this situation, but I want you to board and head home as planned. Mom's waiting, and this shouldn't disrupt your holiday. What's going to happen to her? Zora asked, glancing toward Patricia, who was now seated in a chair near the gate desk, being spoken to by the other executive. Robert's expression grew serious. That depends on what we learn in the investigation. But Meridian has a zero-tolerance policy for discriminatory behavior. What if she just made an honest mistake? Zora asked, suddenly concerned about the potential consequences. Then the investigation will show that, Robert assured her. But from what I heard on the phone and what that passenger witnessed, this wasn't simply a mistake. It was the way you were treated. Before Zora could respond, the gate agent who had replaced Patricia announced, Ladies and gentlemen, we'll begin boarding Meridian Airlines Flight 1372 to Chicago in approximately 10 minutes. We apologize for the delay and confusion. All passengers will be accommodated on the originally scheduled aircraft. Robert checked his watch. I need to join the meeting with the station manager. Will you be okay? Of course, Zora said. I'm fine, Dad, really. He smiled, the corners of his eyes crinkling. I know you are. You're stronger than I was at your age. Text your mom when you land, okay? I'll be home tomorrow morning. With a quick hug, Robert rejoined the airline executives, leaving Zora to find a seat in the waiting area. As she sat down, she noticed several passengers glancing her way, some with curiosity, others with what appeared to be newfound respect. The elderly man who had been in front of her in line took the seat beside her. That was quite something, he said. You handled yourself with remarkable poise, young lady. Thank you, Zora replied, slightly uncomfortable with the attention. Reminded me of the sit-ins back in '63, he continued. I was about your age, working up the courage to sit at a lunch counter in Greensboro. Different times, but that quiet dignity in the face of injustice, that's timeless. Zora turned to look at the man more carefully. You were part of the Greensboro sit-ins. He nodded, a distant look in his eyes. Not the first day, I wasn't that brave, but I joined on the third day, scared out of my mind, but determined. We all were. That's amazing, Zora said, genuinely impressed. I wrote a paper on those protests last year. History now, I suppose, he chuckled. But the lessons remain relevant, don't they? Very relevant, Zora agreed, thinking about what had just transpired. You know, the man said thoughtfully, power reveals character. Some people, when they get a little authority, use it to diminish others. Your father, now he has real power, but he didn't come in shouting or making a scene. That says something about him, and about you. Zora smiled, touched by the observation. He taught me that dignity can't be taken away unless you surrender it. The boarding announcement interrupted their conversation, and the man rose to his feet. That's us. After you, Ms. Johnson. As Zora boarded the plane, finding her window seat in row 12, she reflected on the incident. She had faced discrimination before, subtle glances, security guards following her in stores, teachers who underestimated her capabilities. But this was the first time she had directly challenged such treatment, and the first time her connection to Robert Johnson had been revealed in such a public way. She settled into her seat, stowing her backpack and fastening her seatbelt. The middle seat next to her remained empty as passengers continued to board. Zora was gazing out the window at the tarmac when she sensed someone taking the aisle seat beside her. Mind if I join you? A familiar voice asked. Zora turned to find the elderly man from the gate area. Of course not. I didn't realize we were seated together. We weren't, he admitted with a smile. I was supposed to be in 23C, but the flight attendant was kind enough to accommodate a seat change. He extended his hand. I should properly introduce myself. William Howard. Zora Johnson, she replied, shaking his hand. Nice to meet you, Mr. Howard. Dr. Howard, actually, but Bill is fine, he said, settling into the seat. I'm a professor emeritus of history at Northwestern University. Really? I almost went to Northwestern, Zora said, but I decided on Spelman instead. An excellent choice. My wife is a Spelman alumna, class of '71. The flight attendants began their safety demonstration, and Zora and Dr. Howard fell silent, watching the routine performance. As the plane taxied toward the runway, Zora's thoughts returned to the confrontation with Patricia. She had never used her father's position for personal advantage before, had actively avoided it, in fact. There had been a moment of satisfaction when Patricia realized her mistake, but it was quickly replaced by a more complicated emotion. Zora didn't want special treatment because of who her father was. She wanted fair treatment regardless of who she was. The plane accelerated down the runway and lifted into the air. Beside her, Dr. Howard pulled a book from his bag, The Warmth of Other Suns by Isabel Wilkerson. "Have you read this?" he asked, noticing her glance. "Yes, last summer. It's powerful." "Indeed, I'm rereading it for a lecture series I'm planning." He placed a bookmark on his page and turned slightly toward Zora. "You know, I couldn't help but notice your reaction back at the gate. You seemed troubled even after the situation was resolved in your favor." Zora hesitated, surprised by his perception. "I'm not used to leveraging my father's position. It felt wrong somehow, even though the gate agent was treating me unfairly." Dr. Howard nodded thoughtfully. "I understand that discomfort, but consider this: what happened today wasn't about special treatment. It was about correcting an injustice. The fact that you had a resource to address that injustice doesn't diminish the legitimacy of your grievance." "Maybe," Zora said, unconvinced, "but other people face the same kind of treatment every day without having a CEO father to call." "Precisely," Dr. Howard said, his eyes brightening. "And that's the real issue, isn't it? The arbitrary application of rules based on perceived status or background. The real question is not whether you should have used your connection, but why such a connection should be necessary for fair treatment in the first place." This perspective struck Zora forcefully. She had been focusing on her own discomfort rather than the larger system that made such interventions necessary. "I never thought of it that way," she admitted. "The civil rights movement wasn't just about individual acts of courage," Dr. Howard continued. "It was about changing systems that were fundamentally unjust. Sometimes that means using whatever leverage you have to expose those systems." Their conversation was interrupted by the flight attendant offering beverages. After requesting water for both of them, Zora returned to the discussion. "So you think I did the right thing?" "I think you stood up for yourself with dignity, which is always right," Dr. Howard replied. "And in doing so, you may have created an opportunity for change that extends beyond your individual experience." The plane hit a pocket of turbulence, and they paused their conversation, gripping their armrests until the shaking subsided. "My wife and I were part of the first wave of black professionals at Northwestern in the early '70s, Dr. Howard said once the plane had stabilized. "We faced all manner of slights and obstacles. But we persisted, not just for ourselves, but because we knew our presence was changing the institution for those who would come after us." "Is that why you became a history professor?" Zora asked. "To document those changes?" "Partly," he acknowledged. "But also because I believe understanding history gives us context for our present struggles. When you know what others before you have overcome, it provides perspective and strength." For the remainder of the flight, they discussed history, education, and Dr. Howard's experiences during the civil rights era. Zora found herself captivated by his stories of student activism, the challenges of integration, and the personal costs of standing up for justice. As the plane began its descent into Chicago, Dr. Howard asked, "What are you studying at Spelman?" "Political science with a minor in economics," Zora replied. "I'm interested in policy work, especially around educational equity." "An admirable path," he nodded approvingly. "You know, I run a summer institute for undergraduate students interested in public policy. We bring students to Chicago for 8 weeks of research and mentorship with policy professionals. You should apply." "That sounds amazing," Zora said, genuinely interested. "When are applications due?" "February 1st, he replied, reaching into his wallet and extracting a business card. "Email me in January and I'll send you the details." Zora accepted the card, reading Dr. William Howard, Director, Urban Policy Summer Institute, Northwestern University. "Thank you," she said, carefully placing the card in her wallet. "I definitely will." The plane touched down at Chicago O'Hare International Airport with a slight bump, taxiing toward the terminal. As passengers prepared to disembark, Dr. Howard turned to Zora one last time. "Regarding today's incident, don't underestimate the impact of bearing witness to injustice, even when it happens to you. What occurred was wrong not because you're Robert Johnson's daughter, but because no traveler should be treated that way. Remember that." Zora nodded, feeling a new clarity about the situation. "I will. Thank you for the conversation, Dr. Howard. It's been illuminating." "Me as well," he replied with a warm smile. "I have a feeling we'll cross paths again, Ms. Johnson." As they exited the plane and made their way through the terminal, Dr. Howard offered a final handshake before heading toward baggage claim. Zora continued toward the exit, where she knew Carol would be waiting to pick her up. Outside the terminal, the crisp Chicago air was a sharp contrast to Atlanta's warmth. Zora spotted Carol's silver SUV pulling up to the curb, and she waved, quickening her pace. Carol Johnson, a slender woman in her early 50s with short, natural hair streaked with gray, emerged from the driver's seat and embraced Zora tightly. "Welcome home, sweetheart. How was your flight?" "It was eventful," Zora replied, returning the hug. Carol pulled back to look at her. "Eventful? What happened?" Her expression grew concerned. "Robert called and said there was some issue at the gate, but he didn't give details." "I'll tell you about it on the drive," Zora said, loading her suitcase into the trunk. As they merged into the heavy airport traffic, Zora recounted the incident with Patricia, the phone call to Robert, and her subsequent conversation with Dr. Howard. Carol listened attentively, her hands gripping the steering wheel more tightly as the story unfolded. "That's outrageous," she said when Zora finished. "I'm glad you called your father." "I almost didn't," Zora admitted. "I've been so adamant about making my own way, not using his name or position." Carol glanced at her with understanding. "There's a difference between leveraging privilege for advantage and standing up against mistreatment. You have every right to be treated with respect, regardless of who your father is." "That's essentially what Dr. Howard said. He sounds like a wise man," Carol noted, "and that summer institute could be a wonderful opportunity." They drove in comfortable silence for a few minutes, the familiar Chicago skyline appearing in the distance. Zora had spent 3 years in the city before going to college in Atlanta, and despite the brevity of that time, it had become home in a way no other place ever had. "Your brother's room is all set up for tomorrow," Carol said, breaking the silence. "And I've planned a small welcome dinner tonight, just the 3 of us, unless Robert makes it back early." "Sounds perfect," Zora replied, feeling a wave of gratitude for this woman who had opened her heart and home without reservation. "I've missed your cooking, and I've missed having someone appreciate it properly," Carol laughed. "Robert's on that low-sodium diet from his doctor, and he complains about every dish." They turned onto Lake Shore Drive, the vast expanse of Lake Michigan stretching out beside them, its surface glittering in the late afternoon sun. Zora rolled down her window slightly, inhaling the familiar scent of the lake. "Mom," she said, the word still new enough to feel special each time she used it, "do you think Dad will fire Patricia?" Carol's expression grew serious. "That's not my decision or yours. There will be an investigation, and appropriate action will be taken based on company policies. But what if she has kids to support or other responsibilities? I don't want to be responsible for someone losing their livelihood." "Zora," Carol said gently, "you are not responsible for the consequences of someone else's actions. Patricia made choices in how she treated you. If those choices violated company policies, that's on her, not you." They exited Lake Shore Drive and navigated through the city streets toward the Johnsons' home in Hyde Park, a stately brick house near the University of Chicago campus. As they pulled into the driveway, Zora noticed holiday decorations already adorning the porch, Thanksgiving wreaths and gourds arranged artfully around the entrance. "I may have gone a bit overboard with the decorations," Carol admitted, seeing Zora's amused expression. "Just a bit," Zora teased, helping unload her luggage from the car. Inside, the house was warm and filled with the aroma of something delicious simmering in the kitchen. Zora inhaled deeply, feeling the tension of the day begin to dissipate. "Pot roast," she guessed. "With those carrots and potatoes you like," Carol confirmed. "Go get settled in your room, dinner in about an hour." Zora carried her suitcase upstairs to her bedroom, which remained exactly as she had left it in August, the walls a soft blue, bookshelves filled with her collection of novels and textbooks, photos of her with the Johnsons and her friends displayed on the dresser. She sat on the edge of the bed, taking in the familiar space that had been her first real sanctuary after years of temporary homes. Her phone chimed with a text message from Robert. "Just finished the initial meeting. Flying home tonight instead of tomorrow. How are you feeling?" She typed a reply. "I'm good, home with Mom. We can talk when you get here." A moment later, another chime. "Proud of how you handled yourself today. See you tonight." Zora set her phone aside and began unpacking, arranging her clothes in the dresser and setting up her laptop on the desk. As she worked, Her mind kept returning to the incident at the airport, replaying different moments, imagining alternate scenarios. What if she hadn't been able to call her father? What if she were still Zora Williams, a foster child without connections or resources? The arbitrary nature of the gate agent's authority and how quickly it had crumbled once Robert's name was invoked troubled her deeply. After unpacking, she showered and changed into fresh clothes before heading downstairs. In the kitchen, she found Carol putting the finishing touches on dinner, classical music playing softly from the speaker system. "Need any help?" Zora offered, leaning against the counter. "You can set the table," Carol replied, stirring a pot of gravy. Robert called. His flight lands at 8, so he should be home around 9. Zora gathered plates and silverware from the cabinet and began arranging them on the dining room table. "Has Dad said anything more about what happened at the airport?" Carol hesitated before answering. "He mentioned that it wasn't the first complaint about Patricia Dawson. Apparently there have been other incidents, though none as well documented as yours." This information gave Zora pause. If Patricia had a pattern of such behavior, then the consequences she faced weren't solely about today's incident but part of a larger accountability. Dinner was a pleasant affair, with Carol sharing news about neighbors and family friends and Zora recounting her experiences at Spellman. They were finishing dessert, Carol's famous apple crisp, when the front door opened and Robert's voice called from the entryway. "Hello, where's my welcome party?" Carol and Zora exchanged surprised looks. "You're early," Carol called back, rising from her seat. Robert appeared in the dining room doorway, looking tired but pleased. He embraced Carol warmly before turning to Zora, who had all stood to greet him. "There's my girl," he said, hugging her tightly. "Safe and sound." "I didn't expect you until later," Zora said, returning to her seat as Robert hung his coat on the back of a chair. "Caught an earlier flight," he explained, loosening his tie. "Is that apple crisp I smell?" Carol was already heading to the kitchen. "I'll get you a plate, pot roast too if you're hungry." "Starving," Robert confirmed, sitting down across from Zora. Once Carol had left the room, he leaned forward, his expression growing serious. "How are you really doing, Zora? That situation today was unacceptable." "I'm okay, Dad," she assured him. "Actually, I had an interesting conversation on the plane with a professor from Northwestern. It gave me some perspective." "Oh." Robert raised an eyebrow, curious. "He made me see that what happened wasn't about me using your name for special treatment. It was about exposing a system that treats people differently based on perceived status or background." Robert nodded slowly, a smile spreading across his face. "That's exactly right, and that's why I'm proud of how you handled it, with dignity and assertion of your rights, not entitlement." Carol returned with a plate of food for Robert, setting it before him. "Eat while it's hot. You can continue the serious conversation after dinner." Robert obediently picked up his fork, but his eyes remained on Zora. "We'll talk more later, but I want you to know something now. What happened today is going to lead to some changes at Meridian. Good changes." After dinner, the three of them moved to the living room, where a fire crackled in the fireplace, casting a warm glow over the comfortable space. Robert, now changed into jeans and a sweater, settled into his favorite armchair while Carol and Zora took the sofa. "So," Robert said, steepling his fingers, "I owe you both an explanation of what happened after Zora's flight departed." He described the meeting with the station manager, the review of security footage from the gate area, and the statements gathered from witnesses, including Thomas Wilkins, the Platinum executive member who had spoken up. "The evidence was clear," Robert continued. "Patricia Dawson's treatment of Zora violated our customer service policies and possibly our anti-discrimination policies as well. This wasn't an isolated incident. There have been 3 previous complaints against her in the past year, all involving similar behavior toward minority passengers." "What's going to happen to her?" Zora asked, the question that had been bothering her since the incident. "She's been placed on administrative leave pending a full investigation," Robert replied. "But that's not the end of the story. The incident highlighted some gaps in our training and procedures that need to be addressed." He explained that the airline would be implementing new training for all customer-facing staff on handling identification discrepancies and bias recognition. Additionally, a review of all customer complaint data was being initiated to identify patterns that might indicate systemic issues. "So something good might come from this after all," Carol observed. "That's my hope," Robert agreed. "Meridian has always prided itself on being an inclusive employer and service provider, but we can do better. This incident makes that clear." Zora listened, a new thought forming. "Dad, what if there was a way to systematically track and analyze these kinds of incidents, not just at Meridian but across the industry?" Robert looked at her with interest. What are you suggesting? I'm not sure yet, Zora admitted. But Dr. Howard, the professor I met on the plane, runs a policy research institute at Northwestern. What if there was a project to gather data on discriminatory incidents in air travel and other public accommodations? To identify patterns and propose evidence-based solutions, Robert and Carol exchanged looks of surprise and pride. That's actually a brilliant idea, Robert said slowly. The airline industry has data on everything from baggage handling to on-time performance, but we don't systematically track customer experience through an equity lens. It could be a summer research project, Zora suggested, warming to the idea. Dr. Howard invited me to apply to his summer institute. This could be my proposal. I think you should pursue this, Carol encouraged. It's exactly the kind of meaningful work you've always been drawn to. And Meridian could be your first case study, Robert added. I could facilitate access to our customer service data, properly anonymized, of course. For the first time since the incident at the airport, Zora felt a sense of purpose replacing her discomfort. What had happened to her could potentially lead to changes that would benefit countless other travelers who didn't have the advantage of a direct line to the CEO. The conversation shifted to Thanksgiving plans, Marcus's arrival the next day, and other family matters. Later, as Zora prepared for bed, she reflected on the day's events and the unexpected turns her journey had taken. 3 years ago, she had been a troubled foster child with little hope for the future. Now, she was a college student with a loving family, developing a research concept that could potentially impact corporate policies and customer experiences for the better. The incident at the gate had been unpleasant, even painful, but it had also revealed possibilities she hadn't previously considered. Dr. Howard's perspective had helped her see beyond her individual experience to the systemic issues at play, and her conversation with Robert had shown how those insights could be translated into concrete changes. Zora fell asleep with a sense of determination, her mind already mapping out the research proposal she would develop for the Summer Institute. The next morning, Zora woke to the sounds of activity downstairs, voices, laughter, and the clatter of kitchen utensils. She checked her phone, 8:30 a.m. Stretching, she rose and made her way to the bathroom to brush her teeth before heading downstairs to investigate. In the kitchen, she found a scene of cheerful chaos. Carol was at the stove flipping pancakes, while Robert sat at the island counter reading something on his tablet. But the source of most of the noise was Marcus Johnson, Zora's 21-year-old adoptive brother, who was in the midst of what appeared to be an animated story involving expansive hand gestures. Then Professor Ramirez says, "That's not a proof, that's a prayer," Marcus concluded, causing Robert to burst into laughter. Marcus spotted Zora in the doorway and lit up. "There she is," the sleepyhead arises. He bounded across the kitchen to envelop her in a bear hug, lifting her slightly off the ground. At 6'2", he towered over her 5'5" frame. "Marcus, when did you get in?" Zora asked, returning the hug with equal enthusiasm. "About an hour ago," he replied, setting her down. "Red-eye from San Francisco, I'm running on coffee and adrenaline. And apparently using that energy to tell terrible math jokes," Carol commented dryly, transferring a stack of pancakes to a serving plate. "Not terrible, Mom, sophisticated," Marcus corrected with a grin. "Dad appreciates them." "Dad appreciates that you're studying something he understands," Robert said, looking up from his tablet. "Good morning, Zora. Sleep well." "Like a rock," Zora confirmed, moving to the coffee pot to pour herself a cup. "Why didn't anyone wake me when Marcus arrived?" "You needed your rest after yesterday's ordeal," Carol said, placing the pancakes on the dining table. "Besides, it gave your brother time to regale us with tales of his academic adventures." "Speaking of which," Marcus said, his tone shifting to something more serious, "Dad told me what happened at the airport. That's some BS you had to deal with, Z. Language," Carol chided automatically. "Sorry, Mom, but it is," Marcus insisted. "Zora shouldn't have to call the CEO of an airline to be treated with basic respect." "No arguments here," Robert agreed, joining them at the table. "Which is why we're going to use this incident as a catalyst for some overdue changes at Meridian." Over breakfast, Zora shared her idea for the research project with Marcus, who listened with growing interest. "That's genuinely brilliant," he said when she finished. "Using data analysis to expose patterns of discrimination in customer service, it's the perfect intersection of technology, policy, and social justice." "You think so?" Zora asked, pleased by his enthusiasm. "Absolutely." "In fact," Marcus paused, thinking, "I'm working on a machine learning project for my senior thesis that could be relevant. It's a natural language processing model that identifies subtle bias in written communications. We could potentially adapt it to analyze customer complaint narratives. The siblings spent the rest of breakfast brainstorming how they might collaborate, with Robert occasionally offering insights from his perspective as an airline executive, and Carol watching with obvious pride in her children's passion and intelligence. After breakfast, Marcus announced he needed a nap to recover from his overnight flight, and Robert retreated to his home office for a conference call, leaving Zora and Carol to clean up the kitchen. "It's good to see you and Marcus connecting on something meaningful," Carol observed as they loaded the dishwasher. "You know, when we first brought you home, I worried about how he would adjust to having a teenage sister suddenly appear in his life." "I remember being worried too," Zora admitted. "I thought he might resent me for intruding on his family. But instead, he became your biggest champion," Carol said, smiling at the memory. "Remember how he used to help you with your homework? Staying up late to explain algebra when you were struggling?" Zora nodded, recalling those early days when she had been so resistant to help, convinced it was a form of charity rather than genuine caring. It had taken months for her to trust that the Johnsons' kindness came without conditions or expectations of gratitude. "Marcus always treated me like I belonged," she said softly, "even before I believed it myself." Carol touched Zora's cheek gently. "Because you did belong. You were meant to be part of this family." The moment was interrupted by the ringing of the doorbell. Carol glanced at the clock on the microwave. "That's probably Aunt Vivian. She mentioned stopping by this morning." Sure enough, when Zora opened the front door, she found Vivian Carter, Carol's older sister, standing on the porch with a covered dish in her hands. "Zora, sweetheart," Vivian exclaimed, enveloping her in a one-armed hug. "Look at you, all grown up and collegiate." "Hi, Aunt Vivian," Zora replied, returning the hug and taking the dish. "What did you bring us?" "Sweet potato pie, of course. Can't have Thanksgiving without it." Vivian followed Zora into the house, removing her coat. "Where's my nephew? I heard he was flying in today." "He's already here just taking a nap," Zora explained, leading the way to the kitchen where Carol greeted her sister warmly. Vivian settled at the kitchen table, declining offers of coffee or tea. "I can only stay a few minutes. Just wanted to drop off the pie and confirm dinner tomorrow. Robert's mother is still coming, right?" "Yes, we're picking her up from the senior living facility around noon," Carol confirmed. The conversation drifted to family matters, holiday preparations, and neighborhood news. Zora, having not seen Vivian since the summer, answered questions about college and her classes, carefully avoiding mention of the airport incident. She wasn't ready to discuss it with extended family, especially given Vivian's tendency to dramatize events. After Vivian departed, promising to return the next day with her husband and son, Zora helped Carol prepare for the Thanksgiving meal, chopping vegetables and preparing casserole dishes that could be refrigerated overnight and baked the next day. "Did you decide not to tell Aunt Vivian about what happened at the airport?" Carol asked as they worked side by side at the counter. "You noticed that?" Zora said with a small smile. "Yes, I decided to keep it to myself for now. You know how she gets." Carol nodded understandingly. "She means well, but she would have turned it into the central drama of Thanksgiving dinner." "Exactly, and I don't want that. It happened, we're addressing it, and I'd rather focus on the positive aspects like the research project idea than dwell on the negative experience." "That's a mature perspective," Carol approved. "Though I wouldn't blame you if you did want to talk about it. Keeping difficult experiences bottled up isn't always the healthiest approach." "I know," Zora acknowledged, "but I've talked it through with you and Dad and with Dr. Howard on the plane. I feel like I've processed it. Now I want to channel that energy into something constructive." Carol looked at her with a mixture of pride and something else, perhaps a touch of wistfulness. "Sometimes I forget you're only 18. You have an old soul, Zora Johnson." The rest of the day passed in a pleasant blur of preparations, conversations, and family togetherness. Marcus emerged from his nap in the early afternoon, and the four of them spent time catching up, playing board games, and enjoying each other's company. Dinner was a casual affair of leftovers and conversation that stretched late into the evening. Thanksgiving Day dawned clear and cold, with a light dusting of snow that had fallen overnight, covering the neighborhood in a pristine white blanket. The house quickly filled with the aromas of roasting turkey, baking bread, and simmering gravy as Carol orchestrated the preparation of the feast. By early afternoon, the extended family had gathered Vivian and her husband James, their son Darnell, Robert's mother Alina, and a few close family friends. The dining room was transformed, the table extended to its full length and covered with Carol's best tablecloth, fine china, and crystal glasses that sparkled in the light of the chandelier. As they took their seats for the meal, Robert stood at the head of the table, raising his glass in a toast. Before we begin, I want to express my gratitude for this family, both those related by blood and those who have become family through love and choice. We've had a year of challenges and blessings, growth and change. But what remains constant is the bond that unites us and the love that sustains us. His eyes moved to Zora as he continued. This year, we officially welcomed Zora into our family, though she has been in our hearts for much longer. And as I look around this table, I'm reminded that family isn't defined by genetics, but by commitment, care, and connection. Here, here, Marcus called, raising his glass in agreement. So as we enjoy this meal together, Robert concluded, let's remember to cherish these moments and each other, to family in all its beautiful forms. To family, everyone echoed, clinking glasses. As the food was passed and plates filled, the conversation flowed freely. Zora found herself seated between Marcus and Grandma Alina, whose sharp wit and no-nonsense perspective had always appealed to her. So Zora, Alina said as she buttered a roll, Robert tells me you're thinking about a research project for next summer. Tell me about that. Zora was surprised that Robert had shared this with his mother, but pleased by the interest. As she explained her idea, she was conscious of Vivian and James listening from across the table. That sounds like important work. Alina nodded approvingly when Zora finished. In my day, we didn't have fancy data analysis, but we sure knew when we were being treated differently. Your grandfather and I drove from Chicago to Florida in '62, and we had to carry a green book to know which hotels would accept us. I remember those days, James added solemnly. Things have changed, but not as much as some would like to believe. What happened to you at that airport? That's a perfect example. Zora froze, her fork halfway to her mouth. She shot a questioning glance at Robert, who looked equally surprised. What happened at the airport? Vivian asked, instantly alert to potential drama. There was an awkward pause before Zora decided to address the situation directly. I had an issue with a gate agent who didn't believe my explanation about my ID and boarding pass having different names due to the adoption. Dad had to intervene. Intervene? Darnell, Vivian's son, asked. What does that mean? It means, Marcus interjected, coming to Zora's aid, that a gate agent was on a power trip and treating Zora disrespectfully until she found out who Zora's father was. Classic case of bias. Oh my goodness, Vivian exclaimed, her hand flying to her chest. Were you scared? Was security called? No, nothing like that, Zora assured her, wanting to minimize the drama. It was uncomfortable but resolved quickly. But it shouldn't have happened at all, Carol pointed out firmly. And that's exactly why Zora's research project is so important. These aren't isolated incidents. They're part of a pattern that needs to be addressed systematically. The conversation shifted to broader discussions of bias in various settings, with family members sharing their own experiences. What could have become an uncomfortable spotlight on Zora instead transformed into a meaningful dialogue about systemic issues and potential solutions. As the meal progressed to dessert, including Vivian's sweet potato pie, Zora found herself reflecting on how differently the day might have unfolded if she hadn't called Robert at the gate, if Patricia had succeeded in denying her boarding, if she had missed this Thanksgiving with her family. The arbitrary nature of such moments, how quickly situations could pivot based on available resources, connections, or simple luck, reinforced her determination to pursue the research project. Because while she had the means to challenge unfair treatment, many others did not. After dinner, as the family dispersed to various parts of the house, some to watch football, others to help clean up, a few to nap off the effects of too much turkey, Zora found herself in the study with Grandma Alina, who had requested her company. I wanted a moment alone with you, Alina said, settling into an armchair by the window while Zora took the adjacent seat. To tell you how proud I am of the way you're handling this situation. Thank you, Zora replied, touched by the sentiment. I'm trying to find the constructive path forward. That's exactly what I mean, Alina nodded approvingly. When I was your age, facing discrimination, we had limited options for recourse. We could protest, we could boycott, we could try to change laws, all important tactics. But what you're proposing, using data to expose patterns and drive corporate change from within, that's a powerful approach that wasn't available to us then. She reached out to pat Zora's hand. You're combining the moral clarity of my generation with the technological tools of yours. That's how progress happens, building on what came before, not starting from scratch. Zora hadn't thought of her project in those historical terms before, and the perspective was both humbling and inspiring. I hadn't considered it that way, she admitted. I've been focused on the practical aspects. The practical and the historical are intertwined, my dear, Elinor said wisely. Every small step toward justice is part of a longer journey that began long before you were born and will continue long after we're gone. The important thing is to keep moving forward, using whatever tools are available in your time. Their conversation was interrupted by Marcus poking his head into the room. Sorry to disturb, but Dad's looking for both of you. Apparently, it's time for the annual family photo by the fireplace. As they made their way to the living room, where Robert was setting up a tripod for his camera, Zora felt a profound sense of belonging. This family, chosen and choosing, had given her not only love and stability, but a framework for understanding her place in a larger story of progress and justice. The family arranged themselves by the fireplace, adjusting positions as Robert directed from behind the camera. Zora found herself in the center of the group, surrounded by the people who had become her foundation. As the camera timer beeped, counting down to the shot, she thought about the journey that had brought her here and the path that lay ahead. The flash went off, capturing the moment, a snapshot of family, of belonging, of possibility. In the days that followed Thanksgiving, the Johnson household settled into a comfortable rhythm. Marcus and Zora spent hours refining their ideas for the research project, creating outlines and preliminary methodologies. Robert provided insights into airline operations and data structures, while Carol, with her background in education administration, offered valuable perspective on how their findings might translate into training programs. On Sunday evening, as the long weekend drew to a close, the family gathered in the living room for one last time before Marcus and Zora would return to their respective campuses the next day. The fire crackled in the fireplace, casting a warm glow over the room as they discussed plans for Christmas break and the coming year. I spoke with Diana from the office yesterday, Robert said during a lull in the conversation. The investigation into the gate incident has been completed. Zora looked up from the notebook where she'd been jotting down project ideas. What was the outcome? Robert's expression was serious but satisfied. Patricia Dawson has been terminated. The investigation found sufficient evidence of a pattern of discriminatory behavior, not just in your case, but in previous incidents as well. Zora felt a complex mix of emotions, relief that accountability had been enforced, sadness for Patricia's situation, and hope that the outcome might prevent similar incidents in the future. Additionally, Robert continued, we're implementing those changes we discussed, enhanced training on implicit bias and proper ID verification procedures, plus a new system for tracking and analyzing customer service complaints through an equity lens. You're already doing that? Zora asked, surprised by the swift action. The incident created an opportunity for change that was already needed, Robert explained. Your experience just brought it to the forefront and created the momentum to address it now rather than later. CZ, Marcus chimed in. You've already made an impact and you haven't even started your research project yet. The next morning, as Zora prepared to return to Atlanta, she found herself in the kitchen with Robert, who was making coffee while Carol finished packing some homemade cookies for Zora to take back to her dorm. I wanted to tell you something before you go, Robert said, leaning against the counter as the coffee brewed. Something I haven't shared with the others yet. Zora looked at him curiously. What is it? I've been thinking about stepping down as CEO of Meridian next year, he said quietly. I've accomplished what I set out to do, stabilizing the company after the merger, improving our service metrics, expanding our routes. But I'm ready for something new. Dad, that's unexpected, Zora replied, processing this revelation. What would you do instead? Robert smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. That's where your research project gave me an idea. What if there was an industry-wide initiative focused on equity in air travel? Not just one airline making changes, but creating standards and best practices across the entire sector. You mean like a consortium or a nonprofit? Zora asked, intrigued. Exactly, using my experience and connections to bring airlines together around these issues, creating meaningful, systemic change rather than piecemeal reforms. Zora considered the possibility. That could be incredibly impactful, and it would build on what you've already accomplished at Meridian. It's just an idea at this stage, Robert cautioned. But I wanted you to know that your response to that incident, looking beyond the individual case to the systemic issues, it inspired me to think differently about my own next chapter. Carol entered the kitchen, carrying a container of cookies. Car service just called. They'll be here in 15 minutes, Zora. As Zora finished her preparations and said her goodbyes, she reflected on how a single incident, unpleasant as it was, had catalyzed so many potential changes. Meridian's new training and monitoring systems, her own research project, and now possibly a new direction for Robert's career. In the car on the way to the airport, Zora composed an email to Dr. Howard, expressing her interest in the Summer Institute and outlining her proposed research focus. As she described the project, she felt a growing sense of purpose and clarity. The discriminatory treatment she had faced at the gate was not unique. Similar incidents happened to countless travelers who lacked the resources or connections to effectively challenge them. But through research, data analysis, and systematic examination of patterns, perhaps she could help create a more equitable system for everyone. When the car arrived at Chicago O'Hare International Airport, Zora thanked the driver and made her way inside, her carry-on suitcase trailing behind her. The terminal was busy but not chaotic, the post-holiday rush having subsided somewhat. At the Meridian Airlines check-in counter, she presented her ID and boarding pass to an agent she hadn't seen before, a young man with a friendly smile. "Ms. Johnson," he said, examining her documents, "I see there's a note in the system about your ID and name change. Everything looks in order. Your flight to Atlanta is on time, departing from gate B22. Have a pleasant journey." "Thank you," Zora replied, slightly surprised by the seamless process. As she made her way through security and toward her gate, Zora realized that the changes Robert had mentioned were already being implemented, small adjustments that could make a significant difference in passengers' experiences. At gate B22, Zora settled into a seat near the boarding area, pulling out her phone to check emails before the flight. A new message had arrived in her inbox from Dr. William Howard, sent just minutes ago. "Dear Ms. Johnson, I was pleased to receive your email expressing interest in the Urban Policy Summer Institute. Your proposed research on equity in air travel customer service is precisely the kind of innovative, data-driven approach to systemic issues that our program aims to foster. I would like to discuss this further and provide some guidance as you develop your application. Are you available for a video call next week? In the meantime, I've attached some relevant articles and research methodologies that might be helpful as you refine your proposal. Looking forward to our continued conversation. Warm regards, Dr. William Howard." Zora smiled as she read the message, feeling a surge of excitement about the possibilities ahead. She typed a quick reply, confirming her interest in a video call and thanking him for the resources. As she waited for her flight to be called, Zora found herself observing the interactions at the gate agents assisting passengers, the varied travelers with their diverse needs and expectations, the subtle dynamics of power and service playing out in 100 small ways. There was work to be done, systems to be examined, patterns to be identified, but also opportunities for change, for improvement, for greater equity. And she was ready to be part of that process. The boarding announcement came over the loudspeaker, calling first-class passengers and those needing special assistance. Zora gathered her belongings, preparing to board when her group was called, her mind already mapping out the next steps in her journey, not just the flight back to Atlanta, but the path forward that had been illuminated by a moment of injustice and her response to it. A response that had begun with a simple, composed statement in the face of unfair treatment. "That's perfectly fine, ma'am. I understand you're just doing your job. Would you mind if I make a quick phone call before I step aside?" A small moment that had rippled outward, creating the potential for lasting change, for herself, for her family, and perhaps for countless travelers who would never know her name but might benefit from the systems she helped to improve. As Zora joined the boarding line, she felt the weight of that responsibility and the excitement of its possibilities in equal measure. "Now boarding Group B for Meridian Airlines Flight 843 to Atlanta," the gate agent announced pleasantly. "Please have your boarding passes ready." Zora stepped forward, ready for the journey ahead, both the flight to Atlanta and the larger journey toward a more just and equitable world that had begun with a confrontation at a gate and would continue through research, analysis, and purposeful action. One step at a time, with dignity intact and determination renewed. Thank you for listening. If this story touched you, please subscribe and share your thoughts in the comments.